Hello and welcome to Just One More Watch. Welcome to something a bit different today, perhaps a bit more personal than the usual top-down review style stuff, though I will add in plenty of videos and photos as appropriate as I go today. Perhaps you haven't noticed, but I have got a number of grey hairs on my head, and let me assure you, I have earned every single one of these buggers over the last 40 odd years, and no mistake. Now that means I've been wearing watches on my wrist every single day, more or less, for at least 30 odd years. And the more I think about it, I've been thinking about it quite a bit recently, the stuff that I collect these days, the stuff that I buy, even the stuff that I get in for review on the channel, more often than not, the characteristics and the traits from these watches that I privilege, that I look out for, I can trace directly back to one of 4 key pieces that I have owned in the past. Now, I say owned in the past, I'm not chasing ghosts here, or at least I don't think I am. I still own 2 of the watches. I rebought the 3rd, and the 4th one, it's not a rare piece. I only sold mine a few years ago. I'm sure I could find it again if I wanted to. But it's interesting for me to see, as a contemporary collector, how my current collection has been influenced by a number of key watches that I've worn. I reckon the 4 watches that I'm going to talk about today have probably got about 20 years worth of wrist time between them, so maybe it's unsurprising that I have privileged certain characteristics of those watches in my contemporary collecting. Maybe it's the same for you. If you are a mature age collector, maybe there are a number of key pieces from your past that you keep recycling, if you will, in your current collection. Or if you're just starting out in this hobby and this obsession, maybe you're already seeing maybe 1 or 2 pieces that are coming to define what you collect, the kind of beginnings of the family tree, if you will. So I'm going to run through the 4 watches today that have influenced me the most in chronological order, starting with the one on my wrist. That is the Casio W10. Now the thumbnail today doesn't show a W10, it shows an F91W. I couldn't get a high-res image of the W10, but there is my W10 in all its glory, and there is a Casio W10 with an accessory that I never had, the compass on the strap from the 1985 Casio catalogue. I was born in the 70s, I grew up in the 80s, I perhaps then missed the LED watch thing. Maybe I'm 5 years too young for that, but I was all over digital watches, and Casios specifically in the 80s. They were the coolest things you could get. Think Marty McFly in Back to the Future if you want an example of how cool Casio digital watches were for me and kids like me in the 1980s. Now I've said it before, I didn't own a Casio calculator watch in the 80s, which is probably why I own 3 of them now, but I did own this one and I was fascinated by it. My dad made sure that I could tell the time on an analog clock face, and then I was straight into digitals and straight into Casios. I loved the colours, I loved pressing the buttons, I loved the tiny little pathetic light in the corner that I could hide under my duvet and press after dark. And I still love all of those things about Casios today. I must have a dozen Casio watches in my collection, and I still really enjoy a digital watch. I've tried premium digitals. I bought that Braun one a couple of years ago, but it didn't quite work, so I sold it on. But I'm certainly not averse to adding a more expensive digital watch to my collection in the future. So that was watch number 1 for me then, and it really has influenced a lot of where I have gone as a collector over the 30 odd years that have followed. So remember, if you're buying a watch for your son, your daughter, your niece, your nephew, your cousin or whatever, and it's going to be their first watch, choose wisely, because it will probably have a massive influence on their collection over the decades to come. Watch number 2 that has had an inordinate amount of influence on me over the years is this little Omega Seamaster quartz on the jingly jangly Jubilee, all 34mm of it. I believe it's a 1981, 1982 model. My dad got it secondhand from one of his many girlfriends in the 80s and gave it to me, I think in about 1991. I certainly remember wearing this one to school in the early 90s thinking I was a baller with my little 34mm quartz Omega on my wrist. Now, Omega watches have always been a little more expensive than most. They were not nearly as expensive in the 90s and the 80s as they are now though, and I'll talk about that later on. I'm always amazed that this one has survived. I've had it now for nearly 30 years and the watch itself is pushing 40. I'm amazed I didn't drop it or smash it or sell it or lose it or flush it down a toilet when I was drunk. So what influence then has this little 34mm dressy Omega had on me as a contemporary collector? Well, I guess first and foremost, Omega. I love Omega watches. I've got 4 in my collection. I guess Casio and Omega are my 2 favourite watch brands, and now you know the reason why. When my girlfriend proposed to become my fiancée, who's now my wife, she did so with an Omega Aquaterra. It is a lifer, and I've talked about it several times on the channel. I'm glad she proposed with an Omega and not a Casio, by the way. I guess also size. My personal sweet spot is somewhere between 38 and 42, but I've got no problems going down to a smaller size watch, and this little 34mm Omega was the reason for that. Plus, the jingly jangly Jubilee. I love a Jubilee, and maybe that's one of the reasons why I love the SKX, the 013 and the 009, and also why my Seiko Sarbo 33, a watch that I wear probably disproportionately often, has just received an Uncle Seiko Jubilee. Not technically the most magnificent bracelet in the world, with hollow end links and a press clasp, 2 things that I rail against in more expensive watches, but I think it really suits it, and I think, again, I'm harking back to my days with that Omega on my wrist in the 1990s. Moving on to the 2000s, and it is another Omega, which is actually from 1988 though. It's an Omega Seamaster 200 pre-bond. They're calling it the pre-bond now. They certainly weren't calling it the pre-bond in 1988. You would have needed a time machine or a crystal ball to do that. I don't think they were referring to it as the pre-bond in 2000, even though Pierce Brosnan was wearing the newer Seamaster 300 on his wrist. I got this one for my 25th birthday with money gathered and money earned, and I paid the princely sum of £250 for it from Watches of Switzerland in the Argyle Arcade in Glasgow, which is still a watch shopping mecca in Scotland, really. Like I said, Omegas were not nearly as expensive then as they are now. This thing was mint when I got it, and I have pretty much beaten it to death since then. It was my daily for most of the noughties until I killed the module. I think I cracked one of the dial pins in the dial as well in about 2010 and decided it was best put in a drawer and restored at some point in the future. A lovely watch, and one that, much like the last 2, I spent many a long hour just gazing at its beauty and wonder, and was so appreciative that I owned it and knew that it was a watch that I was going to own forever. I will never ever part with this Omega. So what are the traits and characteristics of that 1988 Seamaster that I currently still privilege in my collection? Well, black dial watches, dive watches, and specifically black dial dive watches. I've had a couple of blue dials over the years, but I really haven't gelled with them at all. I love a black dial watch, I love a dive watch, I love a black dial dive watch, and I've got this Omega to thank for that. I think in about 95% of circumstances, a good black dial dive watch will do the job for you. They really are about the most versatile watches that money can buy. Now, interestingly enough, the integrated bracelet is something that I have not sought to repeat, even though I got on very well with this one over the years. Again, a nice light, slightly smaller than average. This is a 39mm that I wore lower and looser on the wrist as a daily for a decade. Finally then, watch number 4. It's a Tag Heuer Formula 1 Grande Lume dial that I bought in 2012. 2011-2012, I remember that time very well, an interesting time in my life. I split up with my long-term girlfriend of 10 years or so. I got made redundant from my job, and to top it all off, I had a bike stolen. Now, I don't know which of those affected me more at the time, but put it this way, it was a Cannondale. Now, I got a little bit of redundancy money from the job, and I was going back to Scotland, and I went to a duty-free watch store the day before I got on the plane, and I happened to find this Tag Formula 1 in the window. It was a great price, and I got GST back off it by getting on the plane, so I snagged it, and it was my daily for 5 years. Now, I know Tag gets a hard time these days, and I understand the reasons why. The build quality doesn't necessarily match to the price tag, but that F1, I promise you, was rock solid, and a complete little hockey puck of a watch that felt as well made as a hockey puck. Now, 2 traits that I have taken from that one that I still currently favour. Rubber straps. Now I wore that one kind of high and tight on my wrist for about 5 years. Here's some old school footage when I was still recording on my old Samsung Galaxy Note 5 in the very early days of the channel. And I recently picked up the Formex Essence on a rubber strap and I'm wearing it in a very similar fashion. It's got a very similar feel to this old tag did. The second is Lume. That was a Lume dial watch. It was the first Lume dial watch that I'd ever had. I actually didn't know it was a Lume dial watch until I turned off the lights on the first night of ownership and was stunned by the little glowing torch on my wrist. And my obsession with Lume has only grown over the 8 years or so since then. Now I did sell that one about 4 years ago, and as I remember it, I got most of my purchase price back. So you can say what you like about Tag, but there's still a big market for them. They're still one of the most popular Swiss brands. No regrets selling it. I guess as a lifelong F1 fan, I did have to scratch that little Tag Heuer Formula 1 itch at some stage, and it was a watch that I really enjoyed wearing at the time. 44mm though, maybe I'm tending towards smaller watches again, as is the market. So that is my 4 watches that have influenced me more than any other. Casio, Omega, Jubilees, slightly smaller watches, black dial watches, dive watches, rubber straps, and Lume. All stuff that you will see repeated in my collection over and over again, and all stuff that you have seen and I'm sure are well aware of having seen on this channel repeated over and over again as well. Leave me a comment, let me know what watches have influenced you the most if you're just starting out or you're a mature age collector like what I am. Thank you for watching. I will see you in a future video.